Okay, all right. Let's get started. First, let's start the next session, please. First, Vasanth Sarathy will present a paper, Neuro-Symbolic Cognitive System for Intuitive Argumentation.
Thank you.
Ahead. Hopefully you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for that. My name is Vasanth Sarathy, and today I'll be talking about Skeptic. This is a work with other fellow Sifties, Mark Burstein, Scott Friedman, Rusty Bobrow, and Ugur. And this work was in relation to our ARPA score project that we were engaged in with. It was a project that involved looking at scientific literature and evaluating its reliability and the conclusions that are drawn from it. So naturally, scientific argumentation sort of came out of that, came out of some of that work. And so hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit about our system here that we've designed for evaluating arguments. So what I have up here is a slide showing a quote from the Ingram Angle, a program on Fox News that is hosted by Laura Ingram. And here she is presenting a fairly detailed argument about vaccines, and particularly with respect to the government and big pharma. And what happened before this particular excerpt was that Andy Slavitt, who was a former acting administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, had said previously that that kids, below a certain age and around the age of 12 should get vaccinated, and that it's a smart thing to do. And Laura Ingram here presents an argument sort of against that. And her overall big point here is that the government is forcing vaccinations on our children, despite there already being herd immunity, in order to maximize the sales of drugs and increase the money and the coffers of the big pharma. So that's kind of what her argument overall is. And if you look at the argument in the text, you'll see that she's sort of invoking facts. She's saying something that a government official has said before. She's providing a conclusion, her interpretation, of the intent of the government, and she's providing reasons for it, that we don't need vaccinations, as well as some evidence in supporting her reason, that the number of people vaccinated are sufficiently high enough that we don't need to do this anymore. So in a sense, this opinion is an argument, is a complete argument. So what's the problem here? Well, what would it take for us to buy this argument? There's obviously many reasons why we would buy an argument from her. And one of which is, source or institutional trust. Is, do we trust Laura Ingram? And in general, do we trust Fox News? We might also look at the content in more careful depth. And we might ask questions like, is the content factual? Is it, from a rational sense, does it make sense? From a non-rational, emotional, affective sense, does it make sense? And we might even look at it structurally. Are there reasons provided? Which is all the case here. Excuse me. And so one of the key notions here is a concept that was introduced by Dan Sperber, a psychologist out of CNRS in France, who said, believability of newly communicated information must be assessed relative to the background beliefs, which are themselves open to revision. And why this becomes relevant and interesting here is that when we hear new information that potentially conflicts with our prior held beliefs, we sort of go through this process of, we either trust the source or not. And if we trust the source, then we go ahead and update our beliefs to conform to the source. Very little vigilance is actually performed. If we don't trust the source, then we flat out reject the argument as being untrue, and there is no vigilance performed. And if we do trust the source, but the information that's being sent to us is in conflict with our beliefs, then vigilance becomes really difficult because there's a direct conflict and we have to analyze it. And the question really is, why is this an issue even? Why is this a problem? The problem is that without critical thinking, we can create these echo chambers that further amplify polarization. And within these echo chambers, it is really easy to spread misinformation. One of the biggest challenges here. And what's especially hard is that this misinformation can spread implicitly via dubious and subtle arguments. And if you look carefully at Laura Ingram's prior argument, in the middle of this larger argument about whether the government is pushing vaccines because of the big pharma donors, Laura Ingram slips in this claim about herd immunity. And the argument ends up being a crucial premise to the rest of her argument. And the question is that true? Is it that because most adults have gotten at least one shot, many more already have naturally acquired immunity, that we now have herd immunity? Now, this kind of just slipped in, and people would sort of fall for this argument. And the question is, we want to be able to build a system that can help humans with critical thinking, and in the process also model how humans perform argument evaluation. So the first question here becomes, what does make a good argument? And there's argumentation theory and argumentation study has been around for a really long time, and people have looked at it from many different angles, obviously. This was a recent paper by Henning Waxmuth, and they talk about argumentation as argument qualities having these sort of three big spheres of measure. One being logic, which is the idea that the argument has to have some internal structure to it, has to have some internal consistency to it. And then there's the rhetoric, which is the effect of the argument. Is it being persuasive? Is it clear? And then we have the dialectic aspect, which is argumentation itself is somewhat of a dialogue, and how much of that is being considered in the argument itself. Now, in this work that we are focused on, we can't obviously cover all of these different dimensions, but we touch upon a few key ideas around the notion of internal consistency, around the relevance, around the structure of the argument, and around other kinds of background knowledge that may be brought to bear in order to evaluate the argument. And so we're going to take out a few of these pieces and put it into our architecture. The architecture itself is fairly straightforward. There is a central manager that's responsible for managing the process of evaluating an argument, but it's supported by four key elements. The first one being argument interpretation. And this is the idea that when you see a body of text, or you hear somebody speak an argument, that you parse it up into its premise conclusion pairs, that you break it up and you sort of build a structure up. That's what argument interpretation is all about. Then you have this notion of informativeness evaluation, which is the idea that this relates to relevance, and you're evaluating whether things that are being said are relevant to each other. And so are the premises relevant to the conclusions? Do they make sense from that perspective? And by the way, we'll dive into these details of each of these in a second here. And the third piece is sort of inferentially, is the premise playing an inferential role towards the conclusion, and how good is that connection? So we're doing these sort of very quick evaluation steps in our argumentation evaluation process. In addition, there is a memory retrieval. There is a process by which we extract out background information, background knowledge, relevant memories, and even implicit assumptions that may help connect the premise and the conclusions. So let's look at each one in a little bit more detail. Argument interpretation. Here, the first question really is, what does an argument structure look like? And going back to the date on this is 2003, but Tolman's work goes back much before that. And one of the earliest works in sort of structured argumentation. And he talks about the idea of data and qualifiers and conclusions, and warrants are the assumptions that support the argument process, and backings that are evidence for the warrants themselves. More recently, there's been more elaborate structures that have been proposed, schemas, so to speak, in the literature. Here's one example from Stab and Gurevich, where they break apart an argument structure into various sort of these diagrams you can see below, these graph-like diagrams, where you can see basic arguments and linked support and multiple support and such. More recently, there's been also some research to suggest that most of the natural language arguments we see don't have all of these structures. They're pretty straightforward from a structural standpoint. And so for this work, we didn't want to break this problem up too much, and we focused just on very simple structures where you have support and attack relations, and you have sort of, premises and conclusions connected by arrows. Sort of the basic argument or the multiple support or serial support, but not linked support. So how do we do this? How do we implement an argument interpretation system? So we built on some of the work we presented last year at ACS with respect to extracting graphs from text. And what we do is we reapply that similar architecture, but to an entirely different data set and an entirely different problem here, where we're looking at pieces of text and we're extracting graphical-like representations of them. So you do the surface level parse and you get an argument structure that looks like a graph with nodes that are spans of text, and they're called ADUs, that is argument discourse units. And then what we did was we trained the model over several short argumentation dataset essays, a few thousand claims and a few thousand premises. One of the challenges, technical challenges we faced was addressing longer pieces of text. So these essays were, 300 words, 200, 300 words, which is longer than your typical input sentences that we get for breaking this up. So that was a challenge. I mean, we have more details of this in the paper as to what the challenges were, but we were able to deal with that challenge as well. And in the end, we actually ended up doing pretty well just from a purely argument interpretation standpoint in performance. So we just evaluated this one component, and we were able to actually get state-of-the-art performance against other argumentation systems out there. So that was quite nice to see. But it's important to bear in mind that this first step of argument interpretation only gets at the higher level, sort of shallow level. Here is an argument. Here are the pieces of the argument structure. It tells you nothing about the strength of the argument. And you get something like this. So in Laura Ingram's quote, you'll get sort of most adults have gotten at least one shot. Many more already acquired natural immunity through prior exposure to COVID. And therefore, we are likely already at herd immunity. The next piece is the informativeness evaluation. And for this one, the idea here is that the premise and the conclusion have to sort of relate to one another. The premise has some bearing on the conclusion. On the flip side of it is that while they have to relate, the conclusion has to say a little bit more than the premise. There has to be an element of novelty from the conclusion. So the way we implemented that is, again, with the neural network underlying the system, and it's a sentence transformer that just looks at these premise and conclusion pairs and tells you how similar they are. Now, the way this shakes out is that if you had a premise and a conclusion pair that were identical, the sky is blue, therefore the sky is blue, those would be very similar. But obviously the sky is blue, therefore the dinosaurs went extinct is very different. So what you want is something in between, potentially. You want the conclusion to have some bearing on the premise, but not be exactly the same. And so that was a challenge in getting that, in thinking through what that threshold should be. It was somewhat arbitrary in the sense that we picked a threshold between 0.2 and 0.7. And that's, I think, it's open to evaluation and open to experimentation there. But the idea was to get the conclusion to say something a little bit more than the premise, but still be connected to the premise. So again, going back to the Laura Ingram example, you can see that we added another relation here that says extends to suggest that something more is being said in the conclusion over the premise. Finally, we have the connectiveness evaluation, which is another measure for us of the connectivity between the premise and the conclusion. And this relates to the inferential strength. And you can think of inferential very broadly in terms of logical, temporal, causal, whatever connection makes sense from an inference standpoint. It's not just validity. We want to go beyond deduction here. There's a lot of logical arguments that humans make that don't involve deduction. And for this, we use another neural network model that is Roberta Large that was fine-tuned on the natural language inference corpus. Now, the limitation here is that the inference corpus is more closely tied to the notion of entailment. So in some sense, our implementation was limited to the idea of a premise entailing a conclusion. And so in this example here, the purchase of a Houston-based LexCorp by BMI for $2 billion prompted widespread sell-offs by traders as they sought to minimize exposure. LexCorp had been an employee-owned concern since 2008. And so here the conclusion, BMI acquired an American company, is entailed by what was mentioned in the premise here. The final piece here has to do with association and retrieval. And I think this is one of the more interesting aspects here as well, which is why do we need this in the first place? And also, what does it do? How can we implement something like this? So this goes back to the question of rationalizing arguments. I presented an argument earlier from Laura Ingram, and we are attempting to evaluate how good it is. And just like that, we evaluate arguments, and if we trust the source, then we try to find a way to rationalize the argument. We fill in the gaps. There's a lot of research in psychology to support this idea that the rationalization process involves essentially filling in the missing pieces. So if I made the argument, the sky is blue, therefore Ray's dog is thirsty, and let's just take for argument's sake that Ray is my very trusted friend, and Ray just told me this, then I might try to rationalize this. Even though they're very disconnected, they're not, one doesn't logically follow another, and they're kind of separate from each other. I might still try to develop an argument that says something like, Ray's dog is thirsty. That must be because the dog was playing outside in the heat. I know that dogs like to play when it's sunny. And it's sunny outside because the sky is blue. And while playing outside, the dog probably got quite dehydrated from the heat. So you sort of fill in these like missing pieces, and you convince yourself that this argument makes sense if you trust the source. And so what we wanted to do was build out this argumentation framework to allow that process to occur. And surface all of these implicit details. And one of the challenges was, where does that knowledge come from? And one of the ideas was to think about associative memory retrieval. So, a question that I ask people when I think about this is, what do you think of when you hear the word hungry caterpillar? Most people who have, like me, who have young children, might think about the Very Hungry Caterpillar book by Eric Carle, which is a very experiential memory. It has less to do with hunger or caterpillars and more to do with your past recent experiences. And it's the type of knowledge that's not necessarily directly present in a static knowledge base like atomic or concept net. And it's the sort of knowledge we often bring to bear when we make arguments. And so one of the ideas there was to maybe propose using foundation models. And these are neural net models that are large pre-trained models, that are language models or vision models that are trained over large amounts of text and videos in order to do a transfer learning and be able to apply to downstream tasks. Here we're saying maybe these language models can be used for extracting associative memory. And an example would be GPT-3, for instance, is one such language model. And if you gave it something like list 3 associations with the phrase hungry caterpillar, it responds, The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle, a caterpillar's transformation into a butterfly, and a voracious appetite. So what we are seeking is these sorts of associations, as opposed to sort of static knowledge about the shape or the behavior of caterpillars or anything else. And what we do and so the goal here is, from an argumentation standpoint, is to extract out those implicit assumptions. And in order to work with these large language models, many of you may be familiar, the paradigm is sort of a prompt-based in-context learning, where we generate an implicit assumption in the argument, where we give it a task instruction, and a task instruction is essentially a command to say what you want it to do. You might provide it 1 or 2 examples. In this case, we give it an example of an argument and an implicit assumption, and then we have it fill out the implicit assumption for a new argument. And sometimes there's been a lot of work in prompt-based design over the last few months, and some of the ideas involve adding more information to these language models. Now, bear in mind, these language models are essentially sentence completers, right? They're trained over large amounts of text, and their only job is to identify the next word in the sequence. And so it would be wrong to say that they display some level of intelligence, or it would be even wrong to say that they may contain accurate knowledge. But the goal here is not to seek out question answers or factual knowledge, or somehow use that sort of world intelligence, but instead just use its sentence completion abilities to extract out associative memories. That's the kind of thing that maybe we can limit the amount of, we may be able to limit its role in a system like this. But we do that sort of prompt-based in context learning, and we can apply it back to our example from the beginning of this about the herd immunity and COVID. So there we had the premise and conclusion pair that we had before, where you have most adults have gotten at least 1 shot, have already, many more have already have natural or acquired immunity. Therefore, we have herd immunity. When we ran this through our system with the implicit assumption extraction, Here are some examples of the types of assumptions that it was able to pull out. It said, let's assume that the virus will not mutate and the immunity acquired from a prior exposure or natural immunity conferred by antibodies will protect against all variants. Or let's assume that the immunity is going to last. Or let's assume that the herd immunity thresholds have been calculated correctly. Or let's assume that the number of people who have gotten the vaccine or have had prior exposure to COVID is enough to create herd immunity. These were some examples that were automatically generated by our system. And they vary quite a bit. I mean, this is one of the challenges with warrant or assumption generation, is that there's an infinite number of assumptions or warrants. So just generating a few of these, you can see the variety. Everything from questioning the herd immunity, the questioning the inferential step there, and going beyond that. But there's a lot of promise here in this approach in what you can see here. I have cherry-picked these examples. There are examples that it doesn't quite work out. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't, our system doesn't just take these examples and present them as is. What we actually do is have a manager. And the manager has a rationalization algorithm underlying it that helps you build that argument up. And essentially what ends up happening is we have this, we've developed this metric called sturdiness, the graph theoretic type metric. And it's essentially looking for the strength of an argument in terms of the number of links between various pieces of the structure of the argument. The more there are, the more links there are, the better, the stronger the argument. And what we do is we iterate through all the non-sturdy edges and we have GPT-3 or whatever language model there is, generate these assumptions. But we don't stop there. We take one step further and then we update the argument and then we evaluate its degree of connectedness and informativeness. Does the assumption make sense? Is it inferentially valid? And then we recompute the sturdiness. And so we may have to go through multiple rounds of generate and evaluate, generate and test. And that's the process by which Skeptic, our system, builds up implicit arguments. So you can see here an example where the building is full of asbestos, we should tear it down. Is then you sort of walk through its different steps and you arrive at the assumption that says, let's assume that it is cheaper to tear the building down than it would be to remove the asbestos. And that's an accurate assumption in that particular instance. There are limitations to such a system. One is that, like I said before, we simplified the argument structure. And so we cannot capture linked arguments. That is, if two premises need to be combined together to create, to provide the support for a conclusion, that is not captured in our system. There's limited coverage of argument quality. We're only focused on rational arguments. We're only focused on the content of the arguments. We're not focused on any of the affective aspects or anything else. And it's not just that we have to extract out implicit assumptions. Humans, when we hear arguments, we also it also evokes other associations for both the premises and conclusions, and those have to be taken into account as well. We don't do that. And we do not discuss sort of argument construction. We only talk about argument evaluation, which in turn might require some mental modeling and some dialectic aspects as well. The next steps for us are really about evaluations, which is something we haven't done fully yet. It's a challenging aspect to evaluate generation, natural language generation, but that's something we're going to be looking at. Extend the coverage to cover other aspects of argumentation. Extend some of the inferential capabilities. One of the core ideas here was that the title of this talk is Intuitive Argumentation. And one of the ideas that came from Hugo Mercier's work in psychology is, in cognitive psychology, is that human argumentation happens intuitively right at the beginning when you see an argument for the first time. You form this argument structure almost immediately, and reasoning happens after. And in fact, they go one step further. Their whole thesis is about how reasoning exists and has evolved to support argumentation. And I'm not going to go there, but there is a connection between reasoning and argumentation, and they talk about argument structures being formed intuitively. And so that's kind of like something we want to move forward, is think about how these structures will be used going forward. That's it for me for now. There's a lot of details in the paper as well. I'm obviously happy to take questions right now and talk more about it. I've left you on the screen with an example from the paper of a more detailed argument that the system built up. But feel free to contact me via email as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Pat Langley. I like this work. Thank you. I think if you're going to, you may want to pick a less politically loaded topic as an example, or if you're going to do that, you might want to give examples from both sides of the political spectrum. But this did give a great opportunity for you to make a joke about one-shot learning. More seriously, I'm trying to understand, the title is a neuro-symbolic cognitive system, and I want to understand, seems to me most of the action is at putting this higher level reasoning that you've got, and that you could, in principle, replace the neural language model with something else, say something that Sergei Nuremberg invented, and get the same results. Is that true or false? Or is there something about the fact that it's a neural language model that's important here?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, so the neural aspect actually plays into the whole system in a number of places. So it's kind of in all of those various components. If I go back to the architecture, you'll see yeah, right there. It's, in argument interpretation is a neuro-symbolic system. Informativeness evaluation is neural. Connectiveness
I
is neural.
didn't mean to suggest that you weren't using it. My question was whether it has to be a neural network or whether it could have been, say, some other approach to language processing that has pretty broad coverage. Do you really care, or is this just a module, and you're really working at the higher level? You don't care what's handling those pieces. That's the question.
Yeah, no, I see that question, and that's a really good question. I find it hard to, at least for the association retrieval piece, if there are in fact other models, I'm open to looking at them, but without the neural learning that's happened over 500 billion tokens that is able to capture the sort of rich associations, I don't know of another system that can capture that. So I can't say for sure that I can just plug this out and put something else in.
That's okay. If you can't think of it, that's
well.
okay. You're saying you're open to the possibility, but this is what came to mind. That's okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's really interesting work. Just two comments. One is that I think the deep learning community has been amazing at branding, and I understand why they want to call GPT-3 a foundation model, but I don't think that we have to buy into that as a community. The more substantive thing that I wanted to say is maybe I don't understand the goal of the system and whether it's to generate better arguments or to help see through arguments, because it strikes me that making an assumption that is part of an argument explicit can actually serve to weaken that argument. So if you say, the building is full of asbestos, we should tear it down. When you introduce the building is full of asbestos, I assume it's cheaper to tear it down than to take the asbestos out. We should tear it down. That makes me say, well, wait, let's investigate what's cheaper, right? Or if you say, one of the examples that you gave with the Laura Ingraham one was one of the assumptions that you introduced was, let's assume herd immunity has been reached. Therefore, herd immunity has been reached, right? And so if the goal here is to help people understand what are the gaps in the arguments and to help them be skeptical of that, I think that that's great and very effective. But I think that if the goal is to make the arguments stronger, sometimes introducing those assumptions might have the opposite effect.
Great point. Thank you for that point. And thank you for your comment on the foundation models as well. The foundation models term is fairly new from a group out at Stanford. And I think I respect that perspective of yours, in which there's a lot of hype and good marketing on that front as well. And so regarding your point about assumptions and their strengthening or weakening arguments, I think you're absolutely right. And that's one of the goals of this, was to say, okay, if I can make explicit a implicit assumption, which you might not even be conscious of, right, that you're making, or it exists as an assumption, then maybe I can make you think about it and question it. And if there are in fact, crazy arguments, so to speak, if there are conspiracy theory type arguments that might rely on extremely shaky assumptions, then surfacing them is something that's critical to do, because once you've seen them, you can say, well, this thing assumes that pigs can fly. I know pigs can't fly, so this is ridiculous. And you can start to really question those assumptions. And so I started off by talking about critical thinking and helping humans critically think. I think that's one of the core tenets here, from at least from my perspective. It's something that lawyers are trained to do. The LSAT has questions on exactly this, requiring figuring out what the required assumptions are, but not everybody is, and it's really hard to do that naturally. And if you already trust the source, you're going to do that even less. And the idea was to say, okay, let's pull these assumptions out and see if they strengthen or weaken the argument. And I think that is the goal. There's a counter goal, not necessarily counter goal, but a related goal, which is about modeling human cognition, modeling argumentation, how we do argumentation. And I think those two goals are both at play in this paper. And I'm interested in that question as well. And so maybe that's where you're seeing the strength. I'm appearing like I'm strengthening the argument, but I'm not. And I can see why there's a tension there.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, sorry, in the interest of time, I think we need to end the conversation on this paper there. I think also Vasanth has to go as well. But let's thank Vasanth, our speaker.
Thank you.